Hello everyone. Today I am standing behind the Laurel Glen Mausoleum in Cuttingsville, Vermont. I am at the back of the mausoleum and not the front because, at least for now, I am trying to hide something from you. Something truly remarkable and deeply affecting that right now is sitting on the front steps of this little stone building. But before I show you what it is, in order to make sure you fully understand what you're looking at, I need to tell you a story about a man named John P. Bowman, a 19th century business owner, husband, father, and philanthropist who may or may not have believed in the powers of resurrection and reincarnation. Welcome to Cuttingsville. All right, so who exactly was John P. Bowman? Well, for the first few decades of his life, he really wasn't anyone all that remarkable. He was born here in Rutland County, Vermont in 1816. He got involved in the leather tanning business during his teenage years. He opened up his own tannery in New York a few years later, and eventually he made himself quite the sizable fortune manufacturing leather during the U.S. Civil War. And throughout that same time period, John Bowman also enjoyed a rather fulfilling personal life. In 1849, he married a woman named Jenny Gates, who, from what I've read, was just a treat to be around. You know, Jenny was dignified and graceful and self-reliant and courteous, and she was always looking out for those less fortunate than herself, and she was well regarded for her qualities of heart and mind. Just overall, Jenny Gates was a noble woman and wife. And, along with her husband, she also became a mother. John and Jenny had two daughters together, Addie, who sadly died at just 4 months of age, and Ella, who was a continual sunshine about the family circle, a smart young woman who was just as interested in charity as her mother. And for a while, John Bowman was immensely happy with his life. He had a successful business, he was married to his one true love, and he found the highest enjoyment in the companionship of his family. But of course, as I'm sure you can guess, this is not a story about John Bowman living happily ever after with a loving wife and daughter. In 1879, tragedy struck the Bowman household. In June of that year, John's daughter Ella got sick and died at the age of 23. And then, just a few months later, John's beloved wife Jenny also got sick and passed away in January of 1880. And this just tore John Bowman to pieces. Some sources that I've read went so far as to say that John's neighbors never saw him smile again, which I'm sure is an exaggeration, but still, the effect on the man was just immense. So immense, in fact, that John decided to leave New York and come back here to Vermont so he could start up work on two major projects meant to ease the pain of losing his family. The first of those projects was this mausoleum here, which John had built starting in July of 1880. This great stone building was meant to honor the lives of John's family. And trust me when I tell you that he spared no expense. Like, you probably cannot even tell how big this mausoleum actually is with me standing up here close to the camera. So let me actually walk back here so you can get a good sense of the scale of this structure. Just look at that. It is absolutely gigantic. Like 125 men worked on this mausoleum. This building is composed of 750 tons of granite, 50 tons of marble, 20,000 bricks, and 325 barrels of cement. By the time the project was finally finished, John had spent about $75,000 on the monument, which comes out to about $2.3 million in today's money. And although I can't show you the mausoleum in all its glory quite yet, because I'm still hiding that special secret from you, I can show you the wonderful statues that John placed inside the mausoleum. We have a statue of John's wife, Jenny, a statue of his daughter, Ella, and lastly, a stone bust of little Addie, Remember John and Jenny's daughter who died at only 4 months old? Well, John had her relocated to the mausoleum, and there she is, eternalized in stone, reaching out longingly for a loving embrace. Now, of course, we'll be coming back to this mausoleum later, but for now, let's move on to the other major project that John worked on in the early 1880s. Right across the street from the mausoleum is a huge house known today as Laurel Hall or the Laurel Glen Bowman Mansion. This was the home that John built for himself after his family died, presumably to make sure that he could always keep close to his wife and daughters across the street. I can't show you the inside of this building, but just from the outside alone, you can tell how much time and money went into constructing this place. And now, it is at this point in the story that we kind of come to an important pivot point. So far, I've stuck mostly to the facts about John Bowman, the information that I'm almost certain is true. But now, we're going to start to just teeter our way just a little bit into the folklore, the legends surrounding John Bowman and his beautiful old mansion and gigantic mausoleum. See, after John died in 1891, unsurprisingly, a lot of newspapers all around the country started to run stories about the sad tale of the rich Vermont widower who built a giant house and a mausoleum for his dearly departed family. And for the first few decades after John died, these newspapers mostly told the exact same story that I just told you. But right around the late 1930s, all of a sudden, these stories started to change quite a bit. Seemingly out of nowhere, John Bowman went from a broken-hearted family man to an obsessive spiritualist clinging to the idea of reincarnation. So now, what I'd like to do is fill you in on this new dimension of Bowman's story, because nowadays this is actually what the Laurel Glen Mansion is best known for. Just a few decades ago, especially, people were calling this place the most haunted house in America. Thousands of ghost hunters and paranormal enthusiasts used to flock to this mansion, hoping to catch a glimpse of the resurrected spirit of John Bowman strolling through the halls or something. So where exactly did all this paranormal stuff come from, right? Well, as best as I can tell, the whole thing originated with a $100,000 trust fund that John left behind for the care and upkeep of his house and mausoleum, and also the entire cemetery here that John lived across from. And this trust fund actually lasted for decades after John's death. Permanent caretakers lived inside the mansion and tended to all of John's former projects and property, all the way up until about 1948, when finally the money started to dry up and the house eventually became a rental property for various tenants and business owners. Today, it's a historic property maintained by a dedicated group of admirers and historians. Now, I bet that you can guess what I'm about to say next. According to some books and newspapers, the reason that John Bowman wanted his house to be maintained was because he thought that he and his family would one day be resurrected, and he wanted to make sure that the house would be in good condition for their return. Supposedly, Bowman's library was filled with books on reincarnation, and he was absolutely certain that one day he would come stomping out of the foothills with icicles on his majestic mustache and his velvet coattails whipping in the winter wind and his nice beaver hat cocked over a jolly eye, ready to rejoin the world of the living and take up residence once again within his fine home. Now, it's also important to note here that even though this whole paranormal thing started as a reincarnation story, it very quickly became a much more generalized haunted house legend. Like many of the spooky stories that you'll hear about the Laurel Glen Mansion really do not have anything to do with resurrection. Like, for example, here is a story where a little girl supposedly stuck her tongue out at a portrait of Jenny Bowman, and the picture flew off the wall and almost hit the girl in the head. And here's another one where a couple of young men stalled their car out in front of the mansion, and while they were in the process of fixing the problem, the car doors started frantically opening and closing all by themselves. And one time, a glass bowl just exploded all by itself on a buffet table. Like nobody even touched it. It just shattered mysteriously. So clearly this place had a reputation, right? To a point where one of the tenants that rented out the place in the 70s even opened up a haunted house bookstore on the first floor. According to the owner, the first couple nights that he spent in the house were just unbearable. All the doors were slamming and the stairs kept creaking and he could hear footsteps stomping around in the attic, just the whole haunted house 9 yards. But you want to hear something really interesting about all this haunted house stuff? While I was doing research and digging in all these stories, I eventually started to notice that one name was popping up a whole lot in all these books and newspapers. And that name was George N. Jones, one of the mansion's caretakers who spent over 40 years living in the Bowman mansion and watching over the house until he died in 1953. A huge amount of what we know about all the resurrection stuff comes directly from George. Like, I found a ton of fantastic quotes of his talking about keeping the mansion prepared for the return of the Bowman family. Like every day, George and his wife would wind all the clocks and they'd dust the furniture and they'd make sure that the whole house feels nice and clean. And then at night, they would cook a big meal and then set the table for John and his family, just in case that happened to be the evening that the Bowmans came back from the grave. But of course, every night ended with George and his wife just eating the meal on their own. I also want to mention here that George was a really funny guy. Like, a lot of the tidbits that he gave to the newspaper reporters were just so entertaining for me to read through. Like, check this one out. As you can see from these old photos of the inside of the mansion, there used to be a pair of big plaster angels right near the doorway leading out of the house. But apparently, when George moved in, one of the first things that he did was remove those angels, because if John P. Bowman ever actually does come back from the dead, then George does not want anything between him and the door. If old John B. ever comes walking through that front door, then George is gonna be in Nevada before he stops long enough to tell anybody what happened. But as fun as all that stuff is to talk about, there actually is another reason that I'm bringing up George Jones, a pretty big reason. You see, apparently George actually made up all of the John Bowman reincarnation stories. Yeah, I'm not kidding. This is something that you will not find in most of the modern haunted house type stuff, but buried deep in the newspaper archives are a few interviews with either George or someone who knew him, where they basically just confess that George invented all of the supernatural legends. Like, check this out. Here is an interview from 1945 where George explicitly says that he is the one responsible for the explosion of ghost stories. Like, I guess one day he wanted to scare away a housekeeper without having to actually fire her. And so what he did was tell her that the sound of the steam banging through the house's pipes was actually the ghost of John Bowman tearing around in the attic. And just like that, the next day, the mansion had one less housekeeper and the town of Cuttingsville had a brand new ghost story. Or check this out. Here we have a town clerk and historian in 1967 telling a journalist that all the stuff about George and his wife putting out plates for the Bowman family was a complete fabrication from George. Reporters from New York kept badgering him for a story, and he decided that if they wanted a story, then he'd give them a good one. So with all that said, does this mean that the reincarnation legends were fully invented by George? Well, not necessarily. I mean, it's perfectly possible that John really did take an interest in spiritualism near the end of his life. And although it is definitely a bit suspicious that none of the newspaper stories on John ever mentioned anything about reincarnation until decades after he died, still, maybe there is some kind of kernel of truth in there somewhere that George built his story upon. And hey, at the end of the day, even after hearing all of that, if you still want to believe in all the reincarnation stuff and you still want to think of the Bowman Mansion as a haunted house, then more power to you. in my opinion, this is one of those situations where the folklore is fascinating and exciting, even if you don't buy into it. You know, like even if Bowman never did talk about reincarnation when he was alive, isn't it still interesting that all it took for a century's worth of myth and legend to explode out of this mansion was one guy spinning some yarns to a journalist and trying to scare a housekeeper away? Like, after a certain point, even totally fabricated stories become their own version of history once enough time has passed. Like, if enough people believe in something, then the fact that they believe the story becomes just as compelling as the story itself. But at the same time, I think it's also important to not allow the folklore and legend to swallow up the human being at the core of the story here. Because yeah, it's fun to talk about reincarnation and ghosts, but keep in mind that when you strip all that stuff away, you are left with a husband and a father who just missed his wife and kids. A lot. As you can see, at the front of the Laurel Glen Mausoleum is a statue of John Bowman, with his hat and coat in his hand, leaning forward toward the final resting place of his wife and daughters. This was the last detail that John added to the mausoleum, a life-sized figure holding a funeral wreath and a key to the tomb. Bowman never gave an explicit reason for what this statue meant, but for most people, the intent is clear. The marble figure is bent with anguish, leaning forward, eyes angled towards his wife and daughters, waiting and yearning to be with his loved ones. For 10 years, John Bowman lived across the street from his family. According to legend, he used to come over at night and just sit in the mausoleum, reading by candlelight, enjoying the company of his family, until finally, one day, he joined them for good. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.